Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the element of texture, which is the last element of art, so the only one that we have not talked about yet. And texture is a pretty easy element to understand. So texture is just what a surface of an object looks like. So we can divide texture into two categories. And the first category is based on reflection. So this is based on how much light a surface reflects, how much light it bounces back at you. So a shiny surface is one where a lot of light is bouncing back off of the surface of that object. So shiny surfaces are usually things like metal, glass, some plastics, and when you have a shiny surface, you're going to see that there are a lot of highlights, and sometimes you can see the reflections of other objects. Whereas matte surfaces do not bounce light back, so they look very flat, maybe a little bit dull. So some plastics are designed to be matte. A lot of paper is matte. And you'll notice a matte surface because it really doesn't have a lot of highlights or reflections on it. And so the other thing to keep in mind is that some surfaces may be kind of in between, so they might be somewhat shiny or somewhat matte, but you might have a little trouble figuring out which one they are. So things can fall somewhere on more of a spectrum where they can be somewhat more matte or somewhat more shiny. So the other characteristic of surfaces that we need to think about is how even the surface is. So if a surface is very uneven, then we would call it rough. So those surfaces are bumpy, they go up and down, or they might be pitted. And then a smooth surface, which is of course very smooth, very even. You don't really feel any bumpiness or any unevenness when you touch it. So like a piece of silk is usually very smooth. A piece of paper even is very smooth. It has a very even surface. So as artists, we are more concerned with visual texture. So visual texture is what a texture actually looks like. So I could look at a glass jar and I could know that it's smooth, and I can know that it's shiny because light's reflecting off of it. Whereas tactile texture is what the texture actually feels like when you touch it. So usually we can get a sense of the tactile texture of an object just by looking at it. And so as artists working with paper, working with drawing and painting, we are creating this visual texture, trying to recreate a texture on a surface. If we were working with sculpture, then we would actually be working with this tactile texture because we would be making an object that could be touched, although often a lot of sculpture you can't touch, you can only look at it. So it sort of loses some of its meaning as a piece of art when you can't touch it, even though it was designed to be touched. All right, so let's look at some different surface types of objects. So here's a metal object, obviously pretty shiny, and so you can see there are a lot of highlights. So remember that highlights are usually going to be either white or a very light gray, and that shadows are going to be much darker or black. And so not only do we have highlights, we also have something reflected in the surface of the spoon. So a very, very shiny surface, you can have very clear reflections. Objects can also be transparent and shiny. So on the right, we have the actual physical object. This isn't a drawing of this particular glass ball, but it is a drawing of a glass ball. The highlights are different. The shadow is in a different direction than this shadow. So this glass ball we can see through it. There's not anything to really see through. Here there's a blue background that we can see through the glass ball. But we can see a really obvious highlight and some dark shadows. And same thing here, we can see some highlights and it almost looks like there might be some lights reflected in there, and then we do have some shadows. So transparent objects, objects that you can see through, tend to be pretty challenging to draw because you're often drawing what you see through them as well as some bright highlights. So glass objects tend to be pretty challenging. Then we have matte texture, and if you look here, there are parts that are in more light. There's a little bit of shadow here, but there's really no highlight. There's no really white area that light is bouncing off. So this is a very matte texture. It's also a rough texture. And so when you're drawing these matte textures, you're not going to have any strong highlight areas. And you are going to need to draw this rough surface. And typically when we're drawing rough surfaces, the parts that are indented more are going to be black because the light is having more trouble reaching those areas. So this is fur, and fur can be really shiny, it can be really matte. It really depends on the type of fur that an animal has. And so this cat's fur is kind of halfway between matte and shiny. It is reflecting some light. We see some what might be highlights. They could also be white hairs. It's a little hard to tell. And we have some clear shadows in here. So the key to drawing fur is to use a lot of long straight lines, but also to draw in the direction of those lines. So when this person was drawing this patch of fur, they were really thinking about the direction and the shadows in between. So you don't just want to draw a bunch of lines and hope for the best. You really want to think about the direction. So here the lines are going this way and this way, whereas down here they're pointing more this way. But they're not all going in that direction. There are some overlapping from the top going in a slightly opposite direction. So they're crossing each other. Whereas here, everything is facing a very similar direction, and those lines curve as they go. So that's one thing to think about when you're creating the texture of fur. So fabric is another very textured surface, and this is a great example of something that is shiny and smooth. So this is probably silk, or maybe like a fake version of silk. And it's very shiny. So we have very strong highlights, very strong shadows. And it's also smooth. So we have a very even surface. Whereas this is very matte. There's, light hitting some areas, but it's not really a strong highlight anywhere. And they're very rough. So there's a lot of unevenness in the value, and we see highlights, we see shadows, so we can see that these are have a more of a rough surface. So when you're drawing fabric, one of the most important elements is where the fabric wrinkles. So usually the fabric is going to wrinkle in spaces where it's kind of compressed together. So here, because of this ankle of the sock, the fabric has been pressed into a smaller space, so it's wrinkling. And same thing here with the draping. This piece of fabric we know is going to be wider and wider as it gets closer to the edge. So there's extra fabric, and that fabric is bunching up and creating these wrinkles or folds. And so this is what it's going to look like when you draw fabric. So you can see that there's a rough surface that's been created by using light and dark areas alternating. Whereas here you have very large patches of just white and large patches of gray and black. And then let's look at one last texture, which is a woven texture. So this is actually a bit of a shiny texture, not very shiny, but we do see some highlights, and some baskets have a different type of material that they're made of, so they can be very shiny, and then also rough at the same time because we're creating an uneven surface with some pieces going under and some going over. So here we have a very rough surface that's also a little bit shiny. So that is texture. There are a lot of textures that exist out in the world, and the nice thing about texture, if you're having trouble trying to think of textures, just look around you. We're always surrounded by things, and there are always a ton of textures around us that can inspire us if we are trying to do texture exercises, and that can inspire you for the next project.